Well, good evening. Good to have everybody here tonight, and those that are joining us on the live stream. Why, it's certainly good to have you wherever you are. Glad to know that the technology that's out there today allows that to happen, and we're certainly grateful for that opportunity. Tonight we continue our study in Esther. We're going to be looking at the last half of chapter 6 and then chapter 7. As I mentioned last week, I guess if you had a title for today's lesson, it would be The Difference a Day Makes. And so we're going to see a whole lot of things happen in the lesson tonight. And then in the next two lessons, in chapters 8 and 9, there's going to be a change in leadership, a change in policy, a lot of things happening and going on. Chapter 9 will fast forward to the last month of the year. It'll be 12 months from when this first edict went out, and so those things will be coming along. And just to give you a little bit of a heads up on that, Kathy and I will be traveling the next two Wednesdays, and Tim will be covering the class. And that last week we're going to finish up with chapter 10, which is only 3 verses, but we'll just kind of do a compilation of Esther, and then begin looking at our next study, which will be the Song of Solomon. There are study guides that we've got made, and they're not all out yet, but these will be for Wednesday night, and we'll start in March. But I want to do an introduction on that last night that we do Esther. So the first week of March, we'll be doing the end of Esther and the first of Song of Solomon. So just to kind of give you a heads up of where we're going with that. And I appreciate Tim continuing on with the study here in chapters 8 and 9. But those two will really kind of show the change in everything that happens and really brings about some interesting situations within the nation of Persia as how they deal with the Jews. So that's where we'll be tonight with chapter 6 and chapter 7. Before we begin, I've asked Artie if he would to lead us in a prayer. So if you would please bow with us.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the opportunity to meet here tonight with those of like faith, and pray that each one of us has come here tonight with our open hearts and open minds, ready to study your will. Pray that you'll help us to gain the truths that are written in the Book of Esther, even though your name is not exactly mentioned, that we know that your handiwork is well documented in this book, and we know that you are always in control. We pray that you will help us to always submit to your control. Pray that you'll be with Bruce as he leads the class, be with each of us as that we have read and studied and are prepared to participate in the class, and that we all learn much, and that we are edified and can take what we've learned and help spread it to others. We're so thankful for your Son who died for us and all the blessings we have through him. Bless all those who are sick and those who are in need of your blessings. Bless those who have lost loved ones. We ask all these things through your Son. Amen.
Amen. As you remember in chapter 5, Esther had made an appointment or gone in to see her husband, the king, and put her life at risk to do that. And the king asked her what it was that she requested, and she wanted to have a meeting with the king and with Haman, have a small banquet, just the 3 of them and whatever servants were involved. And they had that, and the king says, "So what is your request?" And she says, "Well, my request is that we meet again tomorrow, and I prepared a banquet and to come tomorrow." And so we spoke about that last week. And so, of course, we notice that Haman goes home that night. He's all puffed up with pride that, he's in this position. The queen wants to have a banquet with just him and the king, and so he's excited about this, but he's also angered because at the end of chapter 5, again, he's confronted with Mordecai's lack of respect that he feels towards himself. And so when we began chapter 6, it starts out that the king could not sleep, and so he got out the Chronicles to read and to, just kind of look back over his reign as king and things that had happened. And so he's reading that. And also we mentioned that probably Esther has a sleepless night, because this next day she's going to present her petition to the king and not know how that's going to turn out. And Haman was going to ask for the life of Mordecai, and so he's anxious about this banquet and also about putting together these thoughts for the king. So in chapter 6, the king reads again about the account of an assassination attempt which Mordecai had discovered and disclosed to him, and the king was, of course, saved from that. And the king is wondering, nothing's ever been done for that. We need to do something for him. And so that morning, he asked one of his servants, he said, "Who's in the palace right now? Who's here?" And they said, "Well, Haman." "Well, have Haman come in." And so you remember the king says, what would you suggest to do for someone who the king wants to honor, that really wants to put out there? And so Haman, goes through all these things here in the last, in verses 7 and 8 and 9 of chapter 6. And just to recount, he says, "Let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble princes. And let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" So he's just building this up because he knows he's the person, that I'm the one the king wants to honor. Who else would there be? And so the king says to Haman in verse 10, "Take quickly the robes and the horse of you as said, and do so for Mordecai." His jaw probably dropped as much as his heart. That just changed the whole complexion of this morning meeting that he had come there to talk with the king about. And so what's he going to do? He's going to do exactly that. He says, "Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do for Mordecai the Jew who is sitting at the king's gate, and do not fall short of anything that you have said." And so Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." And Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. I think back to chapter 4 and verse 1, and when the edict is first brought about, who's got his head covered and in sackcloth and ashes and mourning? Mordecai. And now it's Haman. I mean, the roles have completely reversed, and he goes home. He's upset. In verse 13, it says that he recounts to Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that had happened. And then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely befall him." Whose idea was it to build a gallows and hang Mordecai anyway? His wife and his wise men. Now these same people are saying, "Yeah, this isn't going to turn out for you. Turn out well. This is not going to go well at all." And of course, the gallows has been built. He's ready to hang Mordecai. And why do you think that they would make the statement that if this is how things are between you and Mordecai, this is not going to turn out well? What do you, Alan?
Well, my thoughts go to like the reputation of the Jews, like Rahab would be an example of one who had heard the reputation ahead of time and helped the spies. But think back to Deuteronomy 28, verse 7, where the blessings were promised to the people of God, that the one way and will flee before you 7 ways. And well, this was promised, and God did carry that out when the people were faithful, and now we're on the other side of the captivity in a time where the people have returned back to God, and you would expect that things are going to go their way and have that kind of reputation. I think it's already prayed that God's hand is all over the book and not mentioned, and the fact that it's said that if he's of Jewish origin, this is what you would expect, points back to God and God's favor of his people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good assessment of this, as Alan mentions, that God has promised that he would take care of his people. I mean, Mordecai told Esther, you know, if you don't take care of this, somebody will, because God will and has always taken care of his people. And I think back, we mentioned at the beginning of this study that you've got individuals like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar, the kings Cyrus and Darius, and Nebuchadnezzar, the relationships that they had with these Jews. And this isn't current events, but it's not ancient history. This is something that happened soon enough in their life that they're still aware of that. And so they realize Mordecai is almost another Daniel. And before we get through with this book, that's where he's going to be. You know, and as Alan mentioned, Rahab talked about when the spies came into Jericho, she says, we know all about you, you know. And you look at the history, you know, that she knew of about Joseph and the things that have happened and with the wilderness wanderings. This was not done, as Jesus would mention, not done in a corner, you know. This has all been out in the open. And the people are aware of these things. And the Jewish population in Persia is widespread. I mean, there's a large content of their inhabitants that are Jewish and throughout the nation. I mean, when you get to the book of Acts, you look at how far the Jewish influence and the people that know about God is because of this dispersion that people have put out. And so it's no wonder that they look at this now and they say, you may have picked the wrong fella to pick a fight with here because of his background.
Yeah,
Phil?
And they don't even have to go to Deuteronomy, although it's obviously appropriate. Go back to chapter 3. I mean, he's a descendant of Abraham.
Yeah.
You know, what did God do to him?
Yeah.
You know, and the nation itself. So they were lucky to be alive at all. So.
Yeah, true. Wayne, then Jack?
It's amazing to me that King Ahasuerus did not realize the people he's having killed, because he said, do this honor to this Jew.
Sure.
Who he's already given commandment to get him executed.
Right.
But if you go back and look, what Haman doesn't say the Jews, he just calls them people.
Right.
The people.
Right.
And that's seemed like a very inept statesman to sign a bill to destroy a whole race of people and not even know who he's signing for.
Yeah, and again, as we mentioned earlier, that this verse does show that the king doesn't know who this nation is, and even when he gets down to the banquet with Esther, he's not going to know who it is until she makes her plea. He has no insight on that because he's left it all to his most trusted advisor to do so. And like you say, you know, he's saying, you know, you take this out and do this to Mordecai the Jew, and so his accountability is left up to Haman to take care of this. And so I think this shows that he's still unaware of what all the ramifications of that edict were about. Jack?
If you think about this from the standpoint of Haman, I mean, the fear is that he is now involved in an irreversible fall before Mordecai. And over time, there was a recognition of the unique power of the Jew, and at the same time a hatred of it. But there was a recognition over generations of the unique power of the Jew, because They were God's chosen people.
Sure. And as being God's chosen people and the promises made, like Jeremiah had said, in 70 years you're going to go back. Well, that has happened that's current history for these individuals, and the kings have not only supported that, but financed it. And so the Jews have been a favored nation that we're aware of. I'm not sure about the other nationalities, but the Jews have certainly been a favored nation within Persia. And again, as Jack mentioned, and as others have talked about, that hasn't been hidden. That's pretty well aware. And even if you go back to the relationship of Haman perhaps being of the Amalekites and that relationship with the Jews over all of those years and what God had commanded the Jews to do about that, there's no failing to understand the difficulty he's in. And so here he is, he's at home, he's gone home after parading Mordecai through, and I wonder what the people think now, that Mordecai would not bow down to Haman, and now Haman's taking Mordecai through the town and saying, this is the one whom the king wishes to honor. You think about that, and as we mentioned last week and in the weeks before, who is God's people today? Christians. We're God's people today. God has always said, I'll take care of my people, Do we have the faith that Mordecai and Esther and those, Daniel and Shadrach, do we have that same faith that when I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, God will take care of me? That doesn't mean there won't be problems. We read the passage that says, God allows a way of escape for any temptation. What was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's way out? The furnace. That's how they didn't have to fall into the temptation of worshiping idols. They went into a furnace. So sometimes our way out may be very difficult, but there's a way out, and God protects us. Kenneth?
Do you think Haman would realize that God destroyed nations of people to protect the Israelite people? Obviously, his hatred for Mordecai overtook his senses.
Sure. I believe that's absolutely right. He is, and you think about even people today whose anger at someone over whatever just takes over their life, and that's all they think about. We were reading a passage this morning in the Wednesday morning class, which about David honoring Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, and that being a point of grace. But right next to that was an issue where David, and I'm really getting off line here, but this is just extra for you for free tonight. A neighboring king had died, and David sent an envoy over to honor that king, to go to the funeral in his presence and say, we're sorry for your loss, and we want to come and to honor your father. And so this young man is convinced by advisors that they're over here to spy. And so he does some crazy things. There ends up being a battle because they go up against David, and over 14,000 people are killed because one person got upset at a funeral. And you think about how far that goes. And here Mordecai is upset, and he's wanting to destroy thousands of people because of his pride, and that has blinded him to the truth. And again, if Haman had been really checking into the matter, I would have thought he would have, found out who Queen Esther was and got some background on her before he makes the decisions he does, as we see. But he's at home talking with his friends and his wife and upset and discouraged. And it says in verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther has prepared. He still doesn't know what the banquet's going to be about. He's probably still thinking that, this is an honor for him to be there. And so beginning in chapter 7, it says, "Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, 'What is your petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half of the kingdom, and it shall be done.'" In verse 3, I just want to look at the first half of this. Queen Esther replies and says, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king," and then she offers her request. What does this show about Esther?
Submitting herself to the king.
Sure, yeah.
Very humble.
Yeah, she's very humble. She's the queen of Persia. I mean, she has stature above probably every other woman in Persia, and yet that stature was still under the submission of her husband and respecting the authority of the king, So she says, if it pleases you, and if I found favor in your sight. So, and she already has, because he's allowed her to come to him and allowed her to set up this banquet for him to be there. And so she in a humble, not frantic, not upset, not angry, she's making her petition known. And she said, "If it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request." I can't even imagine what's going through the king's mind at this point, And I don't know if Haman even has a clue of what she's about to ask for, because he's not thinking that she's part of this or not. And she says in verse 4, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for troubling you would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." She says, if we were going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't even brought this up. But they're going to destroy me and my people. And the king at this point has no clue what she's talking about. Haman probably hasn't made the connection yet or not. And so King Ahasuerus in verse 5 says, "Well, who is he? And where is he? Who would presume to do this? Who would destroy a nation of people?" And perhaps he's thinking, and maybe Haman made it kind of sound like, there's little pockets of these people that are showing resistance and we need to get rid of them. He hasn't even suggested how huge this edict is and who it's going to affect. And he says, "So who would presume to do this?" And so he's looking at her, and Haman's probably looking at her. And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." And Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. I mean, he never saw that coming, I'm sure. And the king had no idea. And it says in verse 7 that the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. What's this show about the king right now? This action.
He was taken off guard.
Sure. Yeah, it's like, he promised her half the kingdom, and she's basically asked for it because she's asked for a whole nation of people, to save their lives. So he's caught off guard with this. I mean, who is Haman to him before this statement? Yeah, he's my right-hand man. He's my most trusted advisor. He is the person that I have basically given carte blanche to the kingdom to him. And he has done this to me and not let me know what he was doing, and he deceived him. He kept those things quiet, so he's taken aback. He has no clue what else do you see about the king here? Jack?
Well, seen from the perspective of Esther as she presented it, the king would naturally, I think, conclude that there's been a gross violation of justice.
Sure.
And then he goes into a state of inquiry. How is it that this came about? And I would think it would take him to the place where he realizes he's actually been entrapped in this because of the power that he yielded to Haman.
Sure.
To accomplish it. And so there's not only a sense of injustice being perpetrated against Esther and her people, but he also realizes that he's been, to a certain extent, played by Haman.
Sure.
Haman has entrapped him.
Yeah. And he's part of it. You know, he's, you know, you may say, well, I didn't commit this crime. No, but, you know, you made it possible to happen. You know, you turn the other way or whatever, you know. There are a lot of people who are arrested for assisting in a crime, and he certainly had a hand in this. And as Jack mentioned, you know, Haman has deceived him, tricked him, you know, into doing this, and now, and it's interesting because, you know, other than maybe some servants here, I'm not sure who's in the company, but it's just the three of them really, and Esther keeps it confined, you know, to as few people as possible, but certainly says, here's what's going on. Carrie?
It almost seems like the king is so angry he doesn't trust himself to remain there in that situation and has to like step outside into the cool night air for a minute or the cool day air and think it over.
Yeah.
Which of course leads Haman to do his most foolish thing yet.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. He's taking a step back. You know, someone does something that really infuriates you. You know, the kids do something, or your husband or your wife or somebody, you know, and it's like, I need to get a breath. You know, I need to step back here. And that's what he does. And we've noticed in the past, you know, how he reacts, you know, to situations. Alan?
And also the part would be that now he knows he has been trapped. The way the Persian law works, you know, how can Esther's request be granted?
Yeah.
That they be spared. So
Yeah.
many things that would just hit him at one time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He knows the law. You know, when he banished his wife, you know, Vashti, he knew that I can't undo that. It's been done, and this law has been set in motion. I can't undo this. You know what's going to happen here? And you remember before that, Ahasuerus, when he with Vashti and with other things, he would not make a rash decision, but often he would do what? At least in the case with Vashti.
Went to see his wise men and advisors and all that.
Yeah, he talked to others. He brought other people into the situation to get their advice. Well, there's no one here to get any advice from, you know. So right now, he's walking out, and of course Haman's going to help him make this decision in just a moment. Jack?
Sometimes we think about the perhaps oddness of the law that was enacted that can't be reversed. But the logic is that you would never enter into a law invoked like that without considerable deliberation. The
Sure.
reason they have that requirement in place is that so that you don't capriciously enact laws that can't be revoked. But there wasn't due diligence and proper vetting of that law before it was signed into enactment. And he might have assumed that Haman would be completely revealing of the implications. And it's obvious that he wasn't.
Right. Yeah, you look at some of the decisions that the king make. Well, he takes this young woman named Esther. Did anybody ever ask around, where she was from, where she came from? Where'd you pick this girl up from? Do a background check and find out, well, her name's really Hadassah. Well, that ought to throw up some signals or something. But we see here that there's been a lack of, as Jack says, of due diligence and checking things out before you do some of these things. And so we see that action there carried out here. Kenneth, and then Chad.
Well, the king would have no able to turn back. He made an oath to her.
Sure.
So in order to remain his standing word, that he would have to carry out her desire.
Sure. Yeah. And now how am I going to do that? He's made two promises here that are conflicting. And now how am I going to sort that out and fix that? Chad?
Isn't it a good picture of a God who's making king, which doesn't take the actual one that should always take advice and then God, and we see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's trying to rule his kingdom with manly wisdom, and it's not working.
Yeah. That leaning on his own understanding and depending on another individual here, without seeking God's, help with that. Certainly, even among the Jews. I mean, you look at the Jews' history. When they would make a decision, a king would make a decision, or a leader would make a decision without first asking God, or getting direction there, how those decisions turned out. Phil?
I thought it was interesting in verse 5, the NAS says, who would presume to do this or do thus? And I got a footnote in mine that says, whose heart has been filled to do that?
Yeah.
And that sort of goes back to what we've been talking about. Haman's heart was filled with hatred and bitterness, and I think that's probably a better translation.
Sure.
As to the whole situation there. This is what happened, and this is why it happened.
Yeah.
Haman's heart.
Yeah, I have an issue with one individual, but I'm going to destroy millions of people because of this one individual. And so Haman, the king says, like Phil mentions here, who would have a heart filled with that motive? Who would do that? And then she says, Haman. And it falls apart. It says, when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were holding the banquet, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. I don't think this has anything to do with any kind of a sexual advance. I mean, she's probably reclining on the couch. He's on his knees begging her forgiveness because he has no idea she's Jewish until right now. And he has put this into effect. And it doesn't tell us, but at some point after this, between here and chapter 8, somewhere here, Esther is going to reveal to the king exactly who Mordecai is, their relationship, who she is, how this has all come about. He's going to get the whole picture here very quickly, and we're going to see. You'll see next week in chapter 8 the tremendous amount of changes that just bang, bang, bang happen in leadership and the promotion of Mordecai, all these things that are happening. And so between 7 and 8, that revelation is made about how all this even came about. But he's on the couch next to the queen begging for his life, and the king said, would he even assault the queen with me in the house? It's like he conned me into this, and now he's trying to go through my wife, I'm right here, and you've just overlooked me, and instead of begging me for your life, the king, you're going through my wife. This is probably a far stretch, but having been in the situation before, if you have an issue with something that's going on in the congregation that the elders need to be made aware of, talk to them not their wives. That's not their job. And that happens. We go talk to the preacher's wife, or talk to the elder's wife, or talk to a deacon's wife, because, well, maybe I can get what I need, going here. You don't go there. And Xerxes says, you're going to my wife to do this? And as soon as he said that, the servants cover his face, probably put a sack over his head or whatever. They don't even have to ask what to do. It's pretty well decided. And then in verse 9 it says, Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. And there's not really any thinking this out or talking to his advisors or anything. I mean, he's making judgments. And it says, so they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. I can't imagine all the emotions. And this conversation was probably a lot shorter than this class tonight. You think of everything that happened in that moment and the emotions that are going through everyone, and the decisions being made are amazing. And again, as already mentioned in his prayers, as others have mentioned, Jehovah's name is not mentioned here, but you can't help but see his work and the timing and the way things are happening, and Mordecai saying, God will save his people one way or the other. And he's going to use not only Esther, but he's going to use the king to do that. And he's going to use Mordecai to do that. Jack?
It is truly amazing the swift conclusion to which this particular episode is drawn. He is the most powerful king on earth. I mean, this was the ruling kingdom, and recognized as such at this point in time. So his power was immense, and he was not constrained by courts of justice or appeals courts or judicial reviews. I mean, he decided it was going to happen, and it happened.
Yeah. If you came before the king, and Esther knew this, if I go before the king and he hasn't asked for me, and he doesn't accept me, then the result is execution. And as Jack says, there's no court of appeals. There's no, the court will assign you a lawyer. It's done. It's over with. The king has spoken, and that's the end of it. And his servants realize that, and these changes are done. Alan?
Well, this Harbonah, he just got the news of the day, whatever, I guess you translate those measurements, a cubit being 1.5 feet. You're going to hang somebody on 75-foot tall gallows. I mean, people aren't near that tall to hang somebody 75 feet high.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of construction and stuff going on. I mean, everybody, what's going on? Why is this thing being built? And, so this was information that the eunuch knew about, and says, hey, there's this gallows being built by Haman for Mordecai.
Yeah.
I just wanted the news was there.
It's tall enough for everybody to see, and spoiler alert, this is gonna play into a situation in chapter 9, and you wonder, like you say, why 75 feet tall? Well, chapter 9 will tell us why it's 75 feet tall. So I'll let you figure that out, and you can talk to Tim about that when he's covering the class.
I find fascinating this last phrase in verse 8. As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So it seems that these were basically simultaneous events. The king spoke, and boom, his face is covered. And with Harbonah being so prepared to inform the king about these gallows, you have to believe that Haman wasn't exactly a favorite in the eyes of Harbonah. And there may have been many other servants who didn't care for his magisterial approach to his management process.
Sure, because how did the people of the city look at Mordecai? Yeah, with respect, you know, they appreciate him and they knew him. I mean, he's honored in the court of the king because he you know, saved an assassination attempt here. How did the court within the palace, how did they feel about Esther?
Found favor.
Yeah, yeah, she found favor. The people liked Esther. The people liked Mordecai, and this Harbona and the others within the system, as Jack mentioned, the other servants, you know, their respect for Haman might have been about as much as Mordecai's respect for Haman was, you know, and they're not even giving Haman a chance to answer to the king. When they cover his face, I think about, you know, they've gagged him, you know, there's not even going to be any rebuttal here from Haman. The king doesn't need to hear anymore because he knows what Esther's talking about and had no idea of the magnitude of that request that he had put into place. And now, as we see next week in chapter 8, how do we go about taking care of this? What do I do now? I've made two promises. You know, my seal is on this, that this will happen, and I've just promised to the queen that this will happen. So now, how do I fix this? And so, and again, as we've noticed from the beginning, this has already been set in motion. It's already got started. You've got to act quickly on this. It's not going to be, you know, calling a bunch of conventions and meetings and stuff. We need to take care of this. And so we see the complete change. And now when we look at chapters 8 and 9, again, you're going to see Queen Esther, who was always subservient, submissive, respectful. She will stay that way, but she's also going to use her position and her power to make things happen to fulfill God's will. And so we see her becoming much more outspoken. So thank you very much for your attention. We're through with my time for tonight, but certainly encourage you to study ahead and look at chapters 8 and 9 as you look at the rest of the story now and how this changes. Thank you again.